That on? Yes. All right. All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I am Rebecca Slitt. I am an editor and publisher and author at Choice of Games, and that is what I'm here to talk about. So in December 2014, I released my first title for Choice of Games, Psy High. And one of the things I was really proud of was the wide variety in the endings that you could get. At the end of the game, you could be accused of arson. You could win a scholarship to college. You could give magic powers to everybody in your hometown. And since I had conceived of it as a standalone, it didn't matter that the world could possibly end up in so many different configurations. And then I got an idea for a sequel. So today I'm going to talk about how I wrote Psy High 2, High Summer, and my process for turning this standalone into a sequel. So here's what I'll talk about. The main principles of Choice of Games narrative design, how that informs the way our games end in general, and the specific endings of Psy High that came out of this process. I'll talk about the movement from part 1 to part 2, what decisions went into that transition, what challenges it presented, and what solutions I found. Figuring out the balance between writing a sequel and writing a game that could be also played as a standalone, because that was one of my other choices that I made in writing the sequel. I didn't want part 2 to be open only to people who had played part 1. And finally, opportunities to learn and make the first game better, including responding to player feedback and saving one character from a terrible fate. So first, some background info and some disclaimers. Disclaimers, there will be spoilers because this talk is specifically about the endings of part 1. I will have to talk about the endings of part 1. I will try to avoid spoilers for the ending of part 2. Obviously, I hope you will play these games, but if you haven't, spoilers ahead. And second disclaimer, I'm not here to say that this is the one true way to write a sequel. The point of this talk is this is how I wrote a sequel. This is what I did with the tools and resources available to me, how I made these decisions. And the point is that there are multiple ways to go about writing a sequel. So what I hope your takeaway will be is some decision, how to think about the process, how to assess what tools are available to you if you want to write a sequel, and how you can use those tools to create the sequel that you want to your best ability. Some background. So first, background on me. As I mentioned, I am an editor and publisher at Choice of Games. I've been working for them for 12 years, which blows my mind. What this means is that in addition to writing my own game, I have had the opportunity to read and edit and assess a lot of different games written in ChoiceScript. And it is that experience that informed some of the decisions that I've made in writing the sequel. And in case you haven't played Psy High 1, again, I hope you do, but if you haven't, here's some important information that you need to know to understand what I'm going to be talking about. So the tagline of the game is Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets Veronica Mars. You are a high school student in the fictional town of Kingsport. You and some of your friends have psychic powers, and you use yours to solve mysteries. Over the course of the game, you discover that the principal is up to no good, that some of your friends are being mind controlled by a powerful magic device, the vinculum. That's a keyword that's going to show up in the screenshots, and you need to figure out what to do about it. As with all Choice of Games titles, you get to choose the gender of your character and the genders of the potential romances. And that means that the names of some of the NPCs vary. I'm just going to pick one name and stick with it for the NPCs that do for the ease of this presentation. So to establish why I had trouble writing an accidental sequel, I'll say a few words about Choice of Games' overall narrative design and how that contributes to the way our endings work. So first, our most important design principle is that choices matter. There should be real stakes, real chances of success and failure, and meaningfully different effects on the story for success and failure. Second, there are always multiple competing goals. Sometimes these goals are mutually exclusive, as you see here in this screenshot from Psy High 1. You have a lot of things to do. You're a busy high school student, and you can't do all of these things. So what do you focus on? Do you study, focusing on your grades? Do you work on your plot for the big magic device? Do you focus on rehearsing for the drama club play, spending time with your parents, or sleep? Not sleep. So sometimes these are mutually exclusive goals. You have a limited amount of time. You can only do one thing. Sometimes these are multiple approaches to the same goal. Here, you have the goal of get control of the vinculum, the powerful magical device. And the question is, what do you do with it once you get it? Which variation of this one goal are you working towards? Do you want to destroy it? Do you want to study it? Do you want to make it more powerful? And with all of these goals, again, there are meaningful differences in the story depending on whether you succeed or fail at each one. And all of these goals are running through the story simultaneously. You are always interacting with more than one of them. Third, within these goals, there are often multiple degrees of success and failure. For instance, when you try out for the drama club play, do you get the lead? And it says stage manager. The play is Our Town. If you didn't grow up in the US, you may not get it. This play is really frequently performed in high school drama clubs because it's got 1 million characters. Anyway, but the lead is called the stage manager. So when you're trying out for the drama club play, do you get the lead? Do you only get a small part? Were you trying for the lead, but only got a small part? Or did you not get in at all? So you can see how the number of outcomes starts to pile up. And now multiply that by all of the goals that can appear in a game. So by the time you get to the end, you have a whole matrix of outcomes. Successes in some goals, failures in others, multiple degrees of success and failure, and sometimes just differences in the way you built your character, in the personality traits and skills that you have built up, the relationships that you have developed over the course of the game. So there's an enormous amount of variation in how the story turns out at the end. So those are the factors that we're dealing with in creating a sequel to a choice of games title. A matrix of endings with many different simultaneous competing goals, and a design philosophy where choices matter. So given these principles, what are the ways that we have approached making sequels in the past? So here are the first 2 games in the Choice of Games catalog that had sequels. And so these are the first 2 approaches that we tried out. And again, there are many, many more games in the Choice of Games catalog now. But remember, I wrote Psy High back in 2014. We didn't have as many models to follow. So the 2 models that we did have back at the beginning with our first series were the Golden Path or Everyone Continues. And in subsequent years, Everyone Continues has become much, much more popular. And I'll get into that as I go on. For the Golden Path, our model for that is Choice of Romance, Affairs of the Court by Heather Albano and Adam Strong Morse. And in that game, there is only one ending that allows you to continue from part 1 to part 2. And the reason for that is from the story that Choice of Romance was built on. It was originally conceived as the story of Anne Boleyn. You're a young noble at a royal court, and you catch the eye of the monarch. And in part 1, there were other potential romances for the main character. You didn't have to get together with the monarch if you didn't want to. But then as they neared the end of the game and realized that instead of one single game, it needed to be split up into 2 parts, they also realized that only if the main character gets together with the monarch can that story continue. If Anne Boleyn marries somebody other than Henry VIII and goes off and lives in the country happily ever after, then there's no court drama. There's no potential story of the fall and all of the intrigue around that. So what they did was they made a choice that only if the main character gets together with the monarch can you continue to part 2. For the everyone continued, oh, did I forget that? Yes, sorry, that's the slide that you should have been looking at while I was saying all that. I'll let you look at it. Right. All right, so for the other model, there's Choice of the Vampire by Jason Hill. And this was conceived of as a series from the beginning. You play as a vampire starting in New Orleans in the early 19th century. And it was envisioned as an ongoing story of the same character over the course of 200 years. And so, and so the endings were designed with that in mind. They were designed to diverge enough so that you can see the effects of your actions on the world, but not so much that you wouldn't be able to continue the same story. And as I mentioned before, Everyone Continues has become pretty much our standard model for sequels. And that's because we've learned, again, this is where my role as an editor comes in seeing player feedback, we've learned that that is how players really strongly prefer to interact with our games. The Golden Path model does have its own kind of fun. The fun of playing over and over until you get the right combination of endings that will unlock the next story. And again, that is its own kind of fun. Many players really enjoy that. But we've learned that that isn't how the majority of our players enjoy interacting with our games. Instead, they get much more invested in building a character. And building a character means making choices about what relationships you're in. And they want to be able to continue that character. And those choices of relationships matter so much that they want that to be an intrinsic part of the character they build. And so the Everyone Continues model has become our predominant model of sequels. So that is initially the model that I wanted to try. I wanted to make the sequel open to as many people as possible. But I started to run into the same problem that Affairs of the Court had, because there were a few endings that I just could not make fit into a continuation, no matter how hard I tried. Because remember, I hadn't been envisioning it as a sequel, and so I purposely made a wide divergence in the potential endings. For instance, at the end of the game, the PC can choose to give up their magic. But the story is fundamentally about a teenager with psychic powers. And if you don't have psychic powers, then that's a different story. That's not the story that can continue. So there just isn't a way to continue some of those endings. So I did the reverse of the Golden Path. Almost every ending continues, except for a very few. The next challenge was one of my own making. In my effort to make part 2 accessible to as many players as possible, I wanted to make it playable either as a sequel or as a standalone, so people wouldn't feel limited if they hadn't played part 1. And that meant figuring out how to balance the narrative design criteria for a satisfying standalone with a satisfying sequel. So let's go back into general principles for a moment and take the criteria for each. And then I'll talk about how I went about balancing and reconciling these criteria. So what makes a satisfying sequel in an interactive fiction game? It expects that the reader already knows the basics about the setting and the main characters. It doesn't need to spend a lot of time explaining much beyond a brief recap. It feels like a continuation of the same story. Consistency in tone and characters and ideas, yes, but more than that, it should feel like it's building on the previous story. If the main character has learned something, has experienced emotional growth, then that knowledge or growth should still be there. Again, back to our fundamental principles of choices mattering, of choices having significant lasting effects. Specifically, it builds on the relationships from the previous installment. Maybe the people get closer together. Maybe they drift apart. Maybe the dynamic just is different over time. And this is another way, and a really important way, that the emotional growth and narrative choices from the first part can be retained. And fundamentally, the sequel should clearly show the effects of the player's actions in the previous installment. If the player's actions made a significant effect on the world, on another character, on themselves, the sequel should show that that had happened. The sequel should remember those changes. Now, conversely, what makes a satisfying standalone? It feels like a self-contained story. It has its own beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't feel like the middle of another story. It fully explains the setting and premise. You shouldn't feel like you've just entered the party halfway through and everybody knows each other. You should get a thorough introduction to who everybody is and what the setting is. It includes satisfying relationships that you can build from scratch. And it provides opportunities for the player's actions to have meaningful effects on the story. So you see that some of these elements directly contradict each other. Giving a thorough description of the setting and characters versus not needing to. Having a distinct beginning, middle, and end versus feeling like a continuation. Showing the effects of the player achieving their goals and resolving storylines versus leaving room for new goals to be achieved, new effects to be made on the world. And this is where the complexity in the end states really needs to come into play, because for the sequel to be satisfying, you need to see the effects of the player's previous actions, and that means accounting for all of those multiple goals, all of those different outcomes, all of those different degrees of success and failure. But as we've seen, that can get enormously complex. So I needed to make some choices about how to acknowledge all of the end states from part one and make a coherent story in part two, and not getting crushed under infinite complexity. And I want to add that undoing the endings from part one was never on the table. That would be the absolute least satisfying thing. So it's possible. I didn't want to do it. So here are some of the solutions that I found. Probably the easiest one was managing the information flow. People starting fresh in part two would need to know more different information from someone continuing on from part one. So here's a little snippet of code. I've highlighted the relevant bit, just add a true false flag, continuing, and vary the text accordingly. So in this scene, this is from the very beginning of part two. And you see your friend Caitlin using telekinesis. To someone who's continuing from part one, you know all about that. You know who Caitlin is because you've interacted with her before. You know that she's one of the people with psychic powers. And if you're continuing from part one, the code skips you ahead. But for someone starting fresh in part two, this is their first glimpse of something new and interesting. This is the first moment where they see someone using their psychic powers. And therefore, they get more text explaining that basic setting and premise. And as you can see, it says basically the same info as part one. So this is catching you up on that story that you haven't seen before. Conversely, there are some elements from part one that someone in part two wouldn't really care about. If you haven't played the game before, there's a lot of stuff you don't really care about if it's not going to play a big role in part two. So here are two versions of the same scene. This is now outside the code in the player-facing version of it. And it's two versions of a scene with a PC getting together with their friends from high school. So someone starting fresh in part two gets the shorter version of the scene. All they really need to know is this is your hometown, this is your friends, you're having a great time with them. But for someone playing from part one, they remember all of these people. They've met them before, and they might be wondering, like, hey, how's Mike doing? Are Casey and Emma still together? What's going on with them? So they see this update that gives them that information that they're wondering. It helps them touch in with those relationships that they formed in part one, reinforces that those people are there, that the world is still going the way that they experienced it in the first part of the story. So the code preserves that relationship. And the code also preserves the continuity of the PC's personal character development. The code records the personality, skills, emotional traits that they built during throughout the first game. Your stats code moment again, your stats get saved at the end of the first game, and you load them directly into the second. So any character changes that the PC experienced in the first game, in their internal emotional development, in their relationships with others, that's still recorded in the code. So it feels like you're still playing the same person. But then there are the elements that can't be solved so easily, or that contradict each other and that cause problems. And here's where we get into the narrative design solutions, shaping the story of part 2 in a way that we can acknowledge the differences created by the PC's actions, but not need to be so deeply embedded in those differences that the story becomes prohibitively complex. So, for example, there were several versions of the ending of part 1. So one of the things that the PC can accomplish is getting a new principal for their high school, because remember, the old one is up to no good. And so if the PC were still a student in part 2, then who that principal was would really, really matter, because each one was a different kind of leader. That's why it mattered who was principal at the end of part 1. And of course, I'd want to show those differences, again, to show what effect the PC had had on the world. But that would mean writing several permutations of each scene set at school, and that some storylines might not be possible. Again, because Ms. Clay and Ms. Rivera would be two very, very different kinds of leaders, some stories would only be possible for one and not the other. So instead, I decided to set part 2 after graduation. If you're continuing from part 1, you do see the effects of your actions in the flashback to graduation. The same person is still principal, and you still feel the same way about it, because that's another nuance in that variation. You could have actively wanted Ms. Clay to be principal, or you could have not wanted her, but she's principal anyway, and so who's principal and how you feel about it is recorded. But it's after graduation, so you don't have to interact with it a lot. But then there were bigger differences in the environment. Specifically, in one of the endings to part 1, everybody could get magic. And again, opening the door for the player to create a fundamentally different world is great narrative design for a standalone, because it allows the player to do really dramatic things and really see the effects of their actions. But again, after that point, the story is fundamentally different. I'm starting to run into the choice of romance problem, where the wide variation limits the number of stories that you can tell. So I chose to set the part 2 in a different location. It's the summer after graduation. I'll already solve that problem. And you're working as a counselor at a sleepaway camp. So if you did choose to give powers to everyone, you do get to see that in the scenes set before the PC leaves for camp, but I wasn't narratively constrained by that environment. This also solves another one of those problems. Remember, leaving the door open for the player to solve new problems and achieve new goals. In a new environment, there's a whole different set of people to meet, a whole different set of problems to solve. Right. So back to keeping up that continuity. So I needed to be able to show Kingsport enough that people who had played part 1 would be able to maintain contact with the NPCs that the player had built up relationships with. And the one thing that Choice of Games players love most of all is their romances. So I really needed to show the development of the romances. And I'm running out of time, so I will go quickly over this because it's actually kind of simple. So if the PC is still dating the same person that they got together with in part 1, they've been with them a long time, because part 1 ends with a junior prom and part 2 starts after graduation. So you've been dating this person for more than a year. So it was important to be able to show that relationship moving forward if you were still together with that person. And so here you're dating a girl named Haley, and you're having a deep conversation about books, about the future. The relationship feels lived in and deep. Or here's another way that the relationship with Haley can go. You can decide that you're not compatible with her after all, and you want to break up with her. Relationships can change over time. And for people starting fresh in game 2, there are 2 new romance options for them to meet. So you can start fresh with a new relationship if you're just starting in part 2, or if you decide that your character has changed. And this is another way that you can continue emotional growth. So now I want to talk about the opportunity to fix things in part one. Because you can edit a choice script game much more easily than you can edit a published novel, obviously, and sometimes you have to because you have to push bug fixes and all that. I didn't want to make significant changes to part one, except in writing part two, I realized that there were some ways that I needed to fix continuity and in order to do things better. So I mentioned Caitlin before. She's a character with telekinesis, and she's one of the people carrying over from part one. And she's a pretty minor character in part one, which is why I chose to focus more on her in part two, because that meant that I wouldn't have a lot of that variation to deal with in accounting for how she acts and what her relationship is. But then I saw that in the middle of part one, Caitlin loses her powers. And in some endings, she does not get them restored. One of the big choices the player can make at the end of part one is whether or not to restore the powers of people who have had them taken away. But Caitlin really needed to have telekinesis in order to make part two work. So I quietly added another minor character, Simone, who lost her powers instead. She did nothing at all in part one except mentioned, lose her powers. And Caitlin was thus spared from a terrible fate. She always has her powers, and poor Simone, sorry. So another opportunity that this gave me was to actually fix some elements of part one that in retrospect I could have done better. And I'll skip some of them because running short on time. But one thing about player feedback was it let me know when players really liked a storyline or really didn't. And one storyline that they really didn't like was the romance with Tyler. And so Tyler was a romance that I initially conceived of as the trope of that teenage crush who, once you get to know them, is not really that good for you. And so in the epilogue of part one, Tyler breaks up with the PC. And that made a lot of players really upset. More than one person gave feedback that they were disappointed that Tyler broke up with them, no matter how strong the relationship was, no matter how compatible they were. And what I learned from this was another important piece of information about how our players play the game. If they choose a romance, most often that is because they genuinely want that romance. In a novel, it's fine to say this is the main character's motivation, the main character learns and grows and discovers that Tyler isn't that compatible for them. But in a choice of games title, I don't get to say that. The player gets to say that. The player can decide that they are not that compatible with Tyler after all, but more often they're choosing a romance because they genuinely want that relationship. And I, as the author, need to respect that. So I edited part one so that Tyler does not break up with you at the end. And obviously you can't respond to every single piece of player feedback for a lot of reasons, but sometimes feedback will point out something that you missed and give you an opportunity to do something better. So I envisioned part two as the end of the story, widely divergent endings, introduced major effects on the PC and their magic, giving opportunities for the PC and or some major NPCs to go off stage forever. But of course, now I have the idea for another sequel. So tune in next year for Help, I Accidentally Wrote a Trilogy. Thank you.
That's really wonderful. Yeah. So we have a couple of questions online, and also we'll take time for 3 questions here. So come up with a question in this room, but I'll start with one from the chat. So what would you have done, if anything, differently with that first game if you already knew you were going to make a sequel, a trilogy?
Not have taken that sip of water a moment ago. Sorry.
Take your time. And I will also give you a poster.
Okay.
Anybody who asks a question.
Okay.
All day.
Sorry. Well, if I'd known I was writing a sequel, I would not have had the option for the player to give up their magic. I would not have written the endings that put the main character potentially off stage. Mainly those.
Perfect.
Yeah, basically realized which endings would not let me continue to part 2 and not do that.
Okay.
Hi. Curious about the carrying over a relationship from book 1 to book 2 and the breakup option.
Yes.
Is the breakup option only something that's available at the beginning, or can the player realize they like a new romantic interest more and break up later? I was just curious how you handled it.
Yeah, there are several points. There are several potential on-ramps and off-ramps to the relationship. And that's another piece of feedback that I took to heart in writing my second game, that I've learned that our players, there are a lot of different styles and paces that players enjoy in a romance. Some like a slow burn. In fact, in part 2, I put an achievement for the slowest of slow burns, where you can possibly get together. There's one player, your fellow counselor, Pearl, who you can get together with either right away or in the epilogue. So there's a wide variety of potential ways that can go. And that includes staying together with the person you went to the junior prom with, breaking up with them right away and being single, or going through dating nobody at all. It is absolutely possible to not have any romance.
Okay, thank you for that talk. That's really fun. I know my older sister actually beta tested for, I think, the sequel to Psy High, so it's very cool to like, and I also do some beta.
Oh my gosh, well, tell your sister thank you, because the beta
Yes.
testers are great. Like, a lot of the feedback that I've
Right.
incorporated, like, that's from the beta testers. So our beta testers are fabulous. Thank you all.
I wanted to ask, because Psy High takes place sort of like, it was published in what, 2014?
Yeah.
And there's some stuff like Vine, Tumblr, things like that, or it just feels very of that era. And then writing the sequel more than 2 years later, the sequel takes place supposedly 2 years later. How did you manage kind of those like pop cultural, like teen elements?
I tried really hard not to include a lot of current pop culture. That's actually one of the best pieces of advice I got at a writing workshop from someone else who writes YA. Says, don't put anything of the moment in, even though real teenagers talk in a way that, they will never ever talk again. That's the point. Like, if you put that in, then 2 years from now, everybody's going to say that is so, terribly outdated. So I tried really hard not to include any current pop culture references. In part 1, I put some references to songs that were on the radio in the summer of 2014. And in part 2, I talk about iPhones and Netflix. And like you said, Vine and Tumblr and stuff, like, there's always going to be something that is out of date, no matter how hard I try. And I'm never going to be able to predict what that is.
And we'll have to stop there. There are a couple more questions in the chat, and I encourage you to continue this conversation on there.
Great.
This is such a rich territory.
Thank you. And thank you, Discord. When I have a chance to look at the chat, I will do my best to answer those questions in the chat. So keep them coming.
Let's go to the
Thank you.